some more lights on today so that they're all just blaring like a big stadium. All right. Happy Friday, everybody. Looking forward to the weekend. I'm going
Amen.
I'm going to have my grandbaby all weekend. Mom and dad are going out of town and we're going to have a party.
Jimmy party.
A Jimmy party. Actually, it's my 4-year-old great niece's birthday party tomorrow. So Jimmy and Nona's going to a party at my sister's house. So
Look out. It's going to get crazy.
Yeah.
Like ice cream getting thrown and cake getting devoured.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm going to last probably about an hour. I'm going to be honest with you because there's a lot of kids running around out there. But we're definitely going. All right. We're on part 5, page 229. This is titled The Enterprise. What the author calls the imperial and globalist line of thinking was evident during the Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, and Nixon administration, he asserts. He also says that temporarily checked by the outcome of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, reemerged during the Reagan administration. In the 1980s, President Reagan introduced a new and supposedly tougher foreign policy. He was big on the use of covert aid when possible and military intervention when necessary. Operation Urgent Fury, which was the invasion of sleepy little Grenada for apparently no reason, because the reason given was our medical students were in jeopardy any minute of being invaded by communists. But whatever. He goes on to say that the Beirut mission was another, and then Afghanistan, of course, and Nicaragua, of course. He leaves out Angola and all the other ones, but let's just suffice it to say there was a lot of activity going on in the covert arena during President Reagan's administration, which, because of the funding of the Mujahideen, gave us the next 30 years of radical Islamic terrorists. No one ever wants to talk about that part. But this time, Nicaragua was going to be different. And he goes on to name some of the people that were involved in that paramilitary operation. He also mentions, notably, that it was Carter that scaled back significantly covert operations, didn't do away with them, scaled them back by the Halloween massacre and firing like 800 of the people doing them. And that notably, because we give credit where credit's due, he tied foreign aid to human rights. So if you're killing your citizens, which all of the CIA installed military dictators were, you were not eligible for aid. And the aid, as we well know through USAID and military, whatever, that whole foreign aid arena is a slush fund for the CIA. So that was not okay. That all went away when Reagan became president. He didn't actually care about human rights. You could have all of our money you wanted, regardless of how many people in your own country, your own citizens, that you killed. Pains me to say that, but that is just simply fact at this point. So he points out that one of Reagan's first actions was to get rid of Admiral Stansfield. Turner can't have that peacenik in at the CIA. Of course, we know now that he hired William Casey, who just so happens to be a multimillionaire securities lawyer and former OSS agent for all of the oligarchs that we do these covert operations for anyway. So, in Central America, Casey found the perfect case to work with his new organization. Two countries, Nicaragua, where the quote unquote communist, hold on, let me bring Bridget back up, who were not actually communists, by the way, movement under Daniel Ortega had overthrown the CIA installed dictator Somoza 1979, and in El Salvador, where we'd spent a whole lot of time training a whole bunch of death squads that we didn't want to lose control over. So the Reagan administration regarded Nicaragua as just this side of Cuba as far as nefarious people. This little third world country down in Latin America that had literally no threatening capability on the United States, but they're just this side of Cuba. So we're going to take them out. At least they were going to try. And of course, you heard all the rhetoric if you go back. Oh my God, they're endangering the Panama Canal. Oh my God, the country's overran with communists. The same thing. We can't have another Castro in Latin America. So the mission was to train and arm, the support of the anti-Sandinista Nicaraguans, known as Contras. This army was primarily, as we recently learned in our last book, made up of former Somosan National Guardsmen, native Indians, and there were at one point, it's a little bit further in the future, so there was basically three elements: the native indigenous people, the former National Guardsmen, which were all trained by the CIA and School of Americas and blah blah blah, and were torturing everybody in Nicaragua that opposed the dictator, primarily the Sandinistas. And then shortly after the quote unquote revolution of the Sandinistas and throwing out Somoza, there was a faction that left Ortega that had been part of the Sandinistas that moved into Costa Rica. And if you guys remember, that is the guy that would not take any drug money that had been laundered for weapons to arm his people. He didn't want to be in an effort with the National Guardsmen because he had spent the last 15 years fighting against Somoza with Ortega. So he didn't want to be in the same clump with them. The problem for the CIA was the National Guardsmen sucked, and they really needed the other guy because that guy knew how to fight because they had actually won and kicked Somoza out. So he didn't want to corrupt his rebel force with the Somoza thugs, and the CIA couldn't abandon the Somoza thugs because they'd trained them all. So there was this big split. They end up killing the guy that was the former Sandinista in a very evil way. But there was not harmony among the rebels. We'll just say that. And then we have another one of our Forrest Gumps, Major General John Singlet. Another one of those CIA officers sheep dipped into a military uniform. Yeah, Major General John Singlet, who was an OSS veteran, a CIA officer, and somehow still managed to be in the military. He had been responsible for China and Korea during his time in Asia. China meaning Chiang Kai shek and the drug operations, just to make that clear. Singleb's OSS team had worked with E. Howard Hunt, Paul Helliwell, the famous lawyer that set up the fake bank called Castle Bank and bought all the land for Walt Disney in Orlando for Disney World and laundered billions of drug money. Lucien Koenig, who of course we know was the famous French guy that was the liaison between the Southeast Asia drug cartel and the labs in France. And I'm interested that the guy found Mitch Warbell. Most authors don't find him, but he did. You remember Mitch Warbell is the guy that figured out how to put a silencer on a pistol and for assassins. And he's the guy that was killed when he went out to a meeting. I'm not laughing because he was killed, but he had a compound outside of Fort Benning that was basically like a terrorist training camp. And because that was set up when they moved the School of Americas back to Fort Benning, and it's called the Hemispheric whatever blah 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 school. And Mitch Warbell is a CIA contractor. And so he was contracted not only for arms deals, but to do modifications to firearms. He was really smart. And he goes to a meeting out in California with all of the porn publishers. They're all there at one of them's house and they kill him. I don't know who he pissed off, but somebody. So he mentions those people. And he says, according to a Wall Street Journal article, OSS payments at this base often consisted of 5-pound bundles of opium. He's talking about a base in Southeast Asia. And he says that one of Singleb's teammates, Lucien Koenig, went on to be the CIA's liaison with the Corsican Mafia, which I just mentioned. And during the Vietnam War, Singleb directed clandestine infiltration of secret recon and prisoner snatch teams in North Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. While in Southeast Asia, Singleb also worked with none other than Richard Secord and Oliver North. So they're all buddies. Again, it's a very small community. Also, Major General Richard Secord, another one of these guys that's pretending to be a military officer when all he does his entire career is CIA missions. It's so weird. So he was flying around and doing combat missions in primarily Laos in the mid-60s. He served as the air commander of all air operations in Laos, which means he was running the air operations for the CIA. To include coordinating civil air transport, where all the opium was going back and forth. He was a guy doing all of that. And it says these missions, Secord resigned, quote unquote, resigned from the agency in 1983 after being linked to renegade CIA operative Edwin Wilson, who was convicted of smuggling explosives to Libya. That was a setup. That's the guy we were talking about the other day. He's the famous guy that liked to set up, that the CIA had set up all their front companies because he was really good at it. He had a company that did geography of all of the harbors. That was part of that Task Force 157 that he was working with. They went all over the world and basically mapped out, pretending to be civilians, the harbors. So they knew what depth, where you could go in, if you needed to raid the country or whatever. So he was doing intelligence work. But one of his companies got really successful and the CIA didn't trust him to run it anymore and they wanted it. So they just set him up, got him arrested. He got thrown in jail. And because he got thrown in jail, some of the operations that was used in the court case implicated Richard Secord. So he ducks out of sight temporarily. Um, so he reemerges in the Contra operations, of course, because they're going to be secretly moving weapon systems, not just into Nicaragua, but into Iran. And he talks about not just missiles, but high tech weapon systems, which is really weird because we're not supposed to like them. And there's supposed to be an embargo on them, right? In the 1980s. Yeah. But the profits of that were deposited in international banking accounts that they then used to support the Contras. Within 2 years, these funds were attributed to what they referred to as the enterprise, which is basically the CIA off book. It's an entity that is created to run off book operations. They, in addition to the enterprise, which isn't a formal company, it's just the name of the whole network, they set up a bunch of shell companies, front organizations, airfields, airline companies, maintenance companies for the airlines, contract pilots. They buy boats. They buy a shit ton of guns, ammunition, and all kinds of other military equipment. Secord is also credited with milking funds from the Saudi Arabian government for use in the Nicaraguan campaign. Key to these purchases were sophisticated AWACS early warning planes. That was going to be a trade. You help us with this, we'll make sure you get this equipment. Theodore Shackley was the former head of the anti-Castro operation, JM Wave, and he, of course, was the director of Operation 40. He had been in Laos. He worked there. He was actually detailed there by Richard Helms when the Miami station closed down the primary Bay of Pigs aftermath. He also was involved in the Laos operation and drug trafficking. So, what better people to have in Nicaragua when you're using it as a narcotic staging area for cocaine coming out of Colombia than all of these guys that were doing heroin in the Southeast Asia theater? They know how to set the whole operation up, right? Yeah. They just keep going from place to place to place to place. They're a team. So he had a lot to do with the Phoenix program, all kinds of nefarious shit. Shackley worked as a director of the CIA's worldwide covert operations under none other than George H.W. Bush. He ran covert operations for George H.W. Bush, Mr. CIA director, and then he's intimately involved in Iran Contra under Vice President George H.W. Bush. So, Shackley had been slated to become the CIA director under Gerald Ford if Ford had been reelected in 1976. However, Shackley's role in some various other things kind of thwarted him for that, and Ford didn't get elected. Jimmy Carter was like, there's no way in hell I'm doing that. So he had long-standing contacts with Iran Contra affair people, the arms dealers in the Tehran regime. How did you get that? I thought we weren't talking to them. He also was instrumental in training the team that trained and equipped and ran the Contras. Thomas Klein was another one of the characters, and he had been Shackley's second in command at the Miami station. He had been a deputy to him in Laos and had been intimately involved helping Secord run clandestine arms deliveries, both in Laos and then later to the Contras. Klein had put together a quote unquote private aid network even before Reagan was inaugurated. In 1978, he and Edwin Wilson had negotiated a $650,000 deal with Somoza to create a hunter killer organization to be used in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas. So you have the CIA setting up more assassin squads in Latin America. During the presidency of Jimmy Carter, when he told him not to do any of that shit. Like I've said repeatedly, they don't work for the president. They do whatever the hell they want to. Okay. Along with Israeli arms merchants, Klein, who left the agency on bad terms under the Carter realm, was operating in violation of Carter's official policy. No shit. And then one of my top 5 Felix Gumps, he talks about Felix Rodriguez, which I love to do every time we broach this subject, because he's one of the most evil people that we've come across in our Operation Gladio journey. He was a quote unquote retired CIA officer who had served under Klein's in Operation 40. He also had been involved in the ZR rifle assassination team. He had worked in the Congo and Vietnam, and then he went to work for Klein's again in the late 70s as his representative for Latin American arms sales businesses. He's a Cuban exile. He's a member of Brigade 2506. It was Rodriguez who tracked down Che Guevara in Bolivia. They captured him alive and then executed him. And if you haven't heard that story, there's several authors that document based on witnesses that were there that they started shooting him in his lower limbs and slowly worked their way up while he was still alive, finally killing him. And cut off his hands, if I remember correctly. They were very, very evil people. So he also served as the main supply officer at Ilopango Military Air Base in El Salvador, where not only are we training and equipping death squads in El Salvador that morphs into MS-13, but we're also transiting a whole bunch of drugs and arms through that particular airbase. In this role, he had been credited with bringing the Contras logistic mastermind, being the Contras logistic mastermind. So he's the Lyman Lemitsker of the Iran-Contra affair. And then he talks about, real briefly, about Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, of course, with his Vietnam background, that he had worked in counterinsurgency operations there with Singlab and Secord, and that he was kind of the NSC liaison for Iran-Contra. Then Donald Gregg was Vice President Bush's national security advisor and basically the boss of Felix Rodriguez for this operation. Donald Gregg, of course, is a quote unquote former CIA officer that had been in Saigon under Shackley and Klein's. And he had served during the Carter administration as the CIA's liaison to the National Security Council. He's the guy that, while they were doing all the shit behind Carter's back, was their point guy in the National Security Council to hide all their shit. Kind of like what they're doing right now for Trump. Okay. So Gregg served as a NSC CIA liaison and worked close with Oliver North and Felix Rodriguez. He was basically Felix Rodriguez's boss in this operation. According to the book, The Iran-Contra Connection, secret teams and covert operations in the Reagan era, between 83 and 86, Felix Rodriguez had 17 meetings with Gregg, 3 of which was with Gregg and Bush. It was Gregg who introduced Oliver North to Felix Rodriguez. William Casey, former OSS agent, became the CIA director under Reagan. He was the architect of the Contra CIA war against the Sandinistas. According to material that came out in a congressional investigation of the Iran-Contra affair, Casey was the mastermind behind obtaining illegal funds when Congress voted to stop funding them. They didn't actually care, they just kept doing it. One example, Casey managed to convince the Pentagon to give the Contras $12 million in surplus military equipment when they're not allowed to have it. It violated the law. That's what happens when you have these sheep-dipped military officers. It doesn't matter. When Congress discovered this, they prohibited any and all military aid shipments to the Contras, again, because they'd already done it. It was at this time Casey suggested to Oliver North that he phone up his buddy, Richard Secord, Mr. Retired Air Force, CIA guy, and Iranian-born business partner of Richard Secord from the Savak Tehran days. He managed a private supply network for the Contras under North's supervision. For this, he used Saudi and Iranian oil money. Saudi and Iranian oil money. Oh, you mean that sanctioned money from Iran that's not in any banking system? That money? Yes, that money that Trump's finally trying to get rid of and make it a legitimate oil transaction. Because you know what they do with dark money like that? They do things like Iran-Contra. That money was deposited in Swiss bank accounts that were registered under CIA fronts. In early 1981, the CIA set up military training camps. Where? In California and Florida. So I thought the CIA wasn't supposed to be doing shit in the United States, like training terrorists. But we know they did. They did it in, outside of Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. They did it for decades in southern Florida. Yeah. We're going to call them military training camps. They're actually terrorist camps because they don't teach them how to fight like normal military people. These were mimicking the same terrorist training camps that had been set up in Florida and Louisiana for the Cuban exiles. Different country, different location, but always Florida. These camps soon began training um, anti-Sandinista guerrillas. And by the middle of the year, arrangements had been made for these groups to begin raiding Nicaragua while being forward deployed to Honduras, who the CIA already controls. Funding at this early date was given to the Miami based Nicaraguan Democratic Union, the UDN, which was led by Francisco Cardinal, who agreed to join the newly formed Nicaraguan Democratic Force, which was called the FDN. And that is the organization that was doing all of the Gary Webb drug stuff out in California with Freeway Ricky and all of that stuff. The last of the three regional commanders, Eden Pastora Gomez, that's the guy. I refer to him as the good guy. He's at least had morals. He was one of the original uh, Sandinistas that refused to participate with the dirty CIA drug money weapons shit. And at least had standards. He wouldn't fight with the CIA guerrilla thugs out of the National Guard that had always been on the payroll of the CIA and Somoza. And he became a royal pain in the CIA's butt, so they killed him. Okay. In 1982, with funding increases to over $60 million, the war heated up. Under 155 CIA operators and trainers, the FDN reached a strength of almost 10,000 people, terrorists. Those numbers are kind of argued back and forth, but it's approximately 10,000. They were conducting commando raids both across the border and into Nicaraguan ports. Contra aircraft supplied by the CIA and contract agents, flown by Southern Air Transport pilots, flew both supplies and bombing missions into Nicaragua to support the Contras, and boats were supplied for mining the operations. And of course, we read in other books about them mining it and blowing up. I think it was a British ship, because that's an international crime to mine a harbor. These operations were finally brought to world's attention when action took place in the World Court in The Hague by the Nicaraguan government and accusing them of the U.S. of participating in combat missions inside of Nicaragua, which of course they were, and had substantial proof available after they shot down Southern Air Transport C-123 that everybody died on except for Eugene Hagenfoss. So they then could not deny the CIA had been at war with the Nicaraguan government, contrary to everything the Congress had did, regardless of the law. In order to get the fast, massive infusion of cash, now that they'd been exposed again, the enterprise once again turned to what it kept it alive all along, drugs. One of the major drug suppliers in the world was the South American cartels, such as Colombia and Bolivia. Hundreds of tons of cocaine being produced and smuggled around the world, a lot of it reaching the United States. In 1980, the Argentine Confederation Anti-Communist Latino, called CAL, C-A-L, had infiltrated into various countries in a plot to eliminate troublesome Roman Catholic priests and missions that fostered dissent against the CIA installed military dictatorships. a Confederation anti communist Latina organization that had a hit list to knock off Roman Catholic priests. That's crazy. This rise of religious militantism was not something that came into being overnight, but it had been growing ever since Operation Paperclip and Omega Networks days of post world Europe. The Nazis had been smuggled out of Germany into South America and had, by the 1950s, become well entrenched in governments in Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Uruguay, Peru, basically Operation Condor. By the 1960s, the proteges of the Nazi infrastructure, trained in SS tactics, had moved into other countries, including most of Central America, and had brought with them the Gestapo tactics that they had learned. The most militant and capable of the German trainers and advisors came from Argentina. And by German trained, they mean Nazi and CIA. By 80s, Cal was plotting all over Latin America. In that year, Argentine officers bankrolled by the primarily the CIA, but cocaine, installed Luis Garcia Meza as the dictator in Bolivia. Yeah, that was 100% CIA. One of the Argentine officers involved in the action were not actually from Argentina at all. Guess where they were from? Operation Gladio, Italy. Yeah, Stefano Delasce. Yeah, imagine that. Finding those Gladio boys over in Latin America doing coups over there. Huh, that's crazy shit. And Pierluigi Magalia. I don't know how you say his last name. That's close enough. Another was someone even more villainous. None other than Nazi Klaus Barbie was involved, the Butcher of Lyon. Yeah. So we got Nazis, Galen running the Gladio shit in Europe, and we've got the Gladio boys in Italy, and we have their counterparts that we ratlined into Latin America over in Argentina with their P2 Masonic Lodge running operations over there. And we just so happened to borrow a couple of Italian Gladio operators to come over and, help Klaus Barbie, Galen's old buddy, pull off a coup in Bolivia. Nothing to see here. Honestly, you can't make this shit up. This is crazy. But you know what, guys? We're the only one that knows this shit. Nobody talks about any of this. We're literally the only ones that know all of this. It's crazy. So, Delasce and Barbie spearheaded the CAL operation to identify, locate, and exterminate Catholic priests. So, Delasce, Gladio guy, out hunting Catholic priests to kill them. And who was the Archbishop of Argentina at the time? Oh, that's right. Wasn't that Pope Francis? While the priests are being hunted down in Latin America by Gladio operators? Yes, it was. Okay. Delasce met with Major Roberto de Abruzzen, who was the leader in El Salvador, while he was setting up all of his death squads. The CAL conference in Argentina in September of 1980, they met. Delashay, Gladio operator, meeting with the guy setting up the precursor to MS-13 in Argentina at a conference. This meeting produced an agreement to send arms and money to create the death squads in El Salvador. Huh. So they all come from Operation Gladio NATO shit? Yes. Yes, they did. Yes. Yes, they did. All right. The main thrust of the conference, which was attended by all the CIA installed dictators and their senior officers, was to export the Argentine, excuse me, the Argentine solution, meaning death squads, from Buenos Aires to Central America. The first target would be Guatemala, but that country would only serve as a jumping off point for similar operations on their way to El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, Honduras, and Costa Rica. Leave no stone unturned. According to the authors of Iran-Contra Connection, the driving force behind these movements was not the Argentine government, but an international partnership that had developed between Italy, Argentina's secret and political militant Masonic Lodge, P2, and the Milan Banco Ambrosiano, which is Roberto Calvi. The P2 Lodge had been identified by the Italian government as a fascist-oriented secret society of anarchists and neo-Nazis. They're not neo-Nazis, they're actual Nazis. And they're not really anarchists, they're fascist, like the Nazis. Considered part of the infamous Illuminati by some and indirect linked by others to the P2, is little more than a front for a secret order of political manipulators independent of public networks of Masonic lodges. P2 come under considerable scrutiny because of its ongoing involvement in coup attempts involving covert intelligence agencies, bank manipulations, meaning money laundering, and terrorist bombings. He says all of that shit and never mentions Operation Gladio. That's just crazy. P2 had strong links to the CIA, and under Nixon, the CIA allocated $10 million of black funds, which do not require accountability for quote unquote right wing parties in 1972, to include interference once again in the Italian elections. The funds went through Ambrosiano's bank connection, Michele Sedona, Mr. Mafia himself, and the Italian intelligence chief, Vito Miceli, both P2 members. It should be noted that Sedona's American investments were handled by Continental Illinois Bank, headed by Nixon's first Treasury Secretary, none other than David Kennedy, and his legal representative in the US was the law firm of John Mitchell, which just so happens to be Richard Nixon's attorney general. Almost like Richard Nixon's administration was an extension of this entire network. You get that idea? And they use this whole network as part of overthrow in Chile during that time. There's so many connections to the Nixon administration. So it still bugs me on why they overthrew him. Did he threaten them? Did he try to expose it since he knew so much about it? because he's intimately involved in all of this, and everybody around him is. And by the way, Continental Illinois Bank is the bank that was buying up all the Penn Square Bank from Oklahoma that we talked about here recently in the extension of Pete Bruton's book into Oklahoma. So we talked about the whole savings and loan garbage in Texas. They had the exact same racket going in Oklahoma. I'm currently reading a book about the exact same racket in California. This shit was everywhere. And Penn Square was up channeling all of their fraudulent loans onto Continental, and Continental Bank is the bank that when Archbishop Marcinkus gets put in charge of the Vatican Bank, he doesn't know anything about banking. He's basically being a bodyguard for the Pope at the time. So, where does he do his 1 week seminar on how to do banking? Oh, Continental, the CIA money laundering bank for weapons and drug money. Yeah, Continental. Because, of course, he does. And then to read this is just so amazing to me. I gotta read that again. The funds went through $10 million in the 70s when all this money laundering shit is going on, right? Goes through Ambrosiano Bank connection, Michele Sedona, and the Italian intelligence chief, Michele, both P2 members. It should be noted that Sedona's American investments were handled by Continental Bank, headed by Nixon's first Treasury Secretary, David Kennedy, and his legal representative in the US was the law firm of Richard Nixon's Attorney General. So John Mitchell is handling the mafia, what they call the God's banker, Michele Sedona, who ends up going to jail and basically kills himself. Or no, he was poisoned by coffee in his jail cell. That's right. I get all of these murders confused. He was drinking coffee in his jail cell, and it had been poisoned, and he died. So his bank is Continental, who's ran by David Kennedy, who goes on to be the Treasury Secretary, and his lawyer goes on to be the Attorney General. And he's mafia, like not small mafia, like very big world mafia, not like the New York hoodlum. This is the guy, the international mafia guy. All right, moving on. Finally, P2 and Cal had one other thing in common: drugs. Cal's chairman, Suarez Mason, according to Italian magazine Panorama, became one of Latin America's chief drug traffickers. Italian terrorist Delice is suspected of being involved in the French Connection case of the Corsican mafia heroin trafficking. He definitely was. A further connection is Paraguay's intelligence chief, Pastor Coronel, a member of Cal, who was a smuggling partner of Auguste Record, the main Corsican drug buyer in Latin America. We come across him pretty often. Record was the connection via the Corsican mafia to the Gambino mafia family in New York. Actually, the connection was the CIA, but whatever. The organized crime connections and violence means of obtaining funds by the P2, according to author Penny Leno in her book In Banks We Trust, is typical of the time. The P2 crowd obtained money from the kidnappings of well-to-do businessmen in Europe and from the drug trafficking in South America. Sedona's bank laundered money for the notorious mafia kidnappers of an Italian mafia family. After the CIA contributed the 10 million to P2 for the Italian election interference, which followed a large P2 contribution to Nixon's CREEP, Committee for Reelection Fund, and Nixon's resignation following Watergate, the dealings of the CIA came under intensive scrutiny by the Carter administration and the new DCI, Stanford Turner. Subsequent investigations and closings of cash flow conduits affected a parallel operation like Edwin Wilson's Iran arms dealing, which forced him to move to the Libyan weapons and hit team deals for which he'd eventually be jailed. He was also linked to the Nugent Hand Bank of Australia. And finally, the failure of the CIA dependent Banco Ambrosiano also put a kink in their style. These upper level CIA reformers, however, were only a temporary setback because they can outlive anybody. So he goes on to say that as this operation grew in size and intensity, even the enormous profits of the drug running were not enough to sustain it. And they really needed to get Congress to make us pay for it. In late May of 72, Nixon and Kissinger made the Shah of Iran an offer that he couldn't refuse: unlimited access to Americans' non nuclear arsenal for return for a guaranteed flow of Iranian oil and an agreement to serve as the U.S. military stalwart in Western Asia. The Shah agreed, and soon weapon sales began turning cash dollars for the CIA front organizations, and certain U.S. oil companies and banks beginning earning huge profits. The windfalls that were that were brought to the private sector were centered mainly on Eastern banks that specialized in dealing with international oil. Chief among them was Chase Manhattan Bank, of course, whose chairman, David Rockefeller, was a personal friend of the Shah's. The Shah, by the way, of the National Iranian Oil Company, had agreed to recycle much of its oil earnings back into investments in long-term government securities in the U.S. That's why he was allowed to be there. By way of the Chase Manhattan Bank. It is not surprising to find that Henry Kissinger later became chairman of Chase International Advisory Committee. No, it's not unusual at all. By 73, Chase Manhattan loaned Tehran $250 million that went to buy arms and weapons system purchases from us. How do you like that? Isn't that a swift way of doing it? Chase Manhattan is the bank for the weapons manufacturer. They loan money to Iran. Iran takes that money and feeds the military industrial complex, which Chase Manhattan gets rich on because they're their bankers, and they're getting rich off of loaning Iran the money. It's a sweet deal. These transactions were also fortuitous to the American war material industry, because of course it was. The Shah, with his insatiable appetite for modern weaponry, became their best client. In 1974, Iran spent 14% of its GDP on weapons and aircraft. 14%. That's unheard of. 3 years later, the annual purchases had topped $4 billion. The grand total spent prior to the fall of the Shah was $17 billion. So Let me put this in perspective. We, the American people, paid to overthrow Mossadegh. Standard Oil gets cut in on the concession. They make bank. They bank at banks that make bank on this concession profits. And the entire military industrial complex made the estimated $17 billion off of our taxpayer funds that went to overthrow a foreign government and kill a whole bunch of people. That's what I just said. Okay. The armament industry was not only the only commercial sector saved by the Iranian oil money. The construction companies that built the ports and airfields of Vietnam were also benefactors of the Shah's generosity, because they had all these black site prisons that needed to be built and all of these industries that needed to be built. So they're going to have a heyday as well. The largest one of these was Lyndon Johnson's old supporters of Brown and Root. It should be mentioned that Brown and Root received an enormous Cam Ranh Bay contract, among others, from Vietnam. In Iran, Brown and Root managed to glean an $8 billion contract to build a huge port facility at Shah Bahar without the annoyance of competitive bidding. They just called him up and said, hey, you got the job. That port was to become the main Iranian naval base for their fleet of vessels to be built by Litton Industries. So literally everything over there we built. Rockwell International IBX project had been discussed in a previous chapter, but of interest at this point is the huge bribes paid to the Iranian Air Force commander, General Mohammad Khatami, the Shah's brother-in-law. Well, that's close. And how convenient. To win the approval of a $500 million project. Other companies that did business at this time inside of Iran and followed bribes for contract procedures of doing business there was Drummond, Northrop, they were separate at the time, and Bell Helicopter. Not everyone in Washington was happy about these events. Secretary of Defense Schlesinger drafted a memo to then Gerald Ford questioning about our policy of supporting an open-ended Iranian military buildup to continue. And the memo never reached the president because Henry Kissinger made sure it didn't. And 2 months later, Schlesinger was fired. You're not allowed to disagree. That same year, the U.S. established a military advisory group in Iran. 2 years later, almost 8,000 Americans were working in Iran on military contracts, among them Edwin Wilson, Thomas Klein, Theodore Shackley, Richard Secord, and Secord's old Laotian contact, Erich von Marbach. Marbach would later become a key player in the Carter administration's proposal to sell 8 AWACS aircraft to Iran. And Shackley would pave the way for the Reagan administration to deal behind the scenes covertly for the missiles trades. In Tehran, Shackley was a consultant for an arms company called Stanford Technology Corporation. We've come across this one before. That was founded by an Iranian-born dealer called Albert Hakim and did business with the Shah by selling military equipment manufactured by Hewlett-Packard, Olin Corporation, and several smaller companies. Hakim was introduced to Richard Secord by Edwin Wilson, who did business with Libya, using Hakim's office in Switzerland. They also worked supplying electronic equipment, as I mentioned earlier, that IBEX project. They all use the bribe system to get all of this stuff done. And they worked almost exclusively in Iran with the um, terrorist that manned the Savak secret police. David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger both realized what could happen should the Shah's money in the Chase Bank become nationalized under the Khomeini regime. They moved to block any such attempt on the part of Iran to obtain possession of their own assets. With the help of former Aramco attorney, who also happened to be a former chairman of Chase Manhattan, Rockefeller and Kennedy mounted a campaign to grant the Shah asylum in the US for quote unquote medical treatment. The attorney who joined Rockefeller and Kennedy to handle the legal aspects and to weigh the case they had was none other than our old buddy, John McCloy, who for some reason pops up in so many of these stories. John McCloy was the architect of basically the Nuremberg trials, served as the High Commissioner of Germany to protect all of the Nazis. He had served on the Warren Commission, to hide who actually killed JFK, and presided over the CFR. In the end, Carter, after being told that the Shah would cash in billions of dollars in US government securities if not allowed to come, and basically they threatened Carter saying, "We will crash the US banking system if you don't allow him to come." That's the other side of the story that you never hear. So he agrees to do that. As a consequence, the foreign relations and people point to that being the spur that instigated the revolution and the radicalism, because to add insult to injury, as we found out in other books, they flew a black CIA aircraft into Iran to exfiltrate him to the United States, and allowed everyone on the ground to know that it was the CIA picking up the Shah to excavate him to New York City. And people in Iran lost their shit because they knew exactly what was going on. And the people behind the scenes, Rockefeller and Kissinger, and notice that Kissinger goes to Harvard and sets up his thing with Rockefeller funding and CIA funding on Harvard, that fake entity that he was using to do all this shit out of. So, yeah, they set the whole thing up. Okay, that's it for today. That's a lot. What do we got?
I got a question for you.
Okay.
About, that Naib Bukele, the new president of El Salvador.
Bukele.
Yeah. Bukele. He, made that massive prison, and he's actually it's a reform prison where they're actually producing. Is he rehabilitating, essentially, and trapping a lot of these operatives that we keep coming across in all these nefarious fuckery?
So, as far as the evolutionary chain from the CIA assisted created death squads into MS-13, the importation of them into the United States, and then the terror that they reigned throughout El Salvador and that entire region. I look at, and this will be very controversial to people who've not listened to our stories sourced on the Uyghurs, that the CIA exfiltrated out of China and trained in Nepal to be basically terrorists internal to CIA and the work camps that were set up there. Now, I have no idea what Bukele's long-term plans are with these people, if you can ever unbrainwash them so that they're not like, see, I don't know, because it's psychologically, I don't know what that type of um, mentality, what happens to your brain when you're a cold-blooded killer. Can you ever be reformed, or do you stay in a work camp program for the rest of your life, and they just eventually all die out? Psychologically, I don't know, because that's not my area of expertise, but um, I think that, to your point, that he is doing the only thing that is feasible for the longevity of El Salvador. Those people cannot walk among normal people, until at some point, if it is psychologically feasible to rehabilitate them, that happens, whether it takes 20 years, 30 years, or whatever, it has to be done. And to his point, if you can produce things for the betterment of the country as a result of that, good on them. I mean, we used to make prisoners in America work. We don't do that anymore for the most part, but they used to have to. Um, Travis, go ahead.
I'm pretty sure all those serving in Kaylee's new prisons are serving life without the possibility of parole. He said you're taking like the worst. Like one of the people he has is sentenced to 500 years without the possibility of parole. Another one 400.
I know that, but I'm just saying,
they're not going to be released into the public at any time.
Okay, Travis, I understand that's the position now. We know that in the future, Bukele is not going to be president forever of El Salvador either. I was just making the point that I don't know if people like that is capable of ever being reformed. It is my opinion. I don't think so. I'm well aware that they're not supposed to ever get out, but having said that, we understand that there are turnover in administrations and countries, and at some point, Bukele is not going to be president. But hopefully, anybody that comes to power in or is elected in El Salvador will ensure that continues, because I don't know if their constitution allows pardons or commutations or any of that other stuff. So yeah, I'm aware that they're not supposed to ever get out, and hopefully that's the case. But there's a lot of people in Americans' prisons that are never supposed to get out that somehow keeps fucking getting out and repeat offending. Okay. War Hamster, did you want to say something?
Sure, why not? Love that our boy McCloy shows up again. He's he's all over, the stuff, the work you and I've been doing. Does show up in some amazing places. The funny part is when he was named to the Warren Commission, his job was the president of the World Bank,
right?
Which makes him incredibly qualified to investigate a presidential murder. Why?
Well, because it was done on behalf of them.
We know that. I just don't understand how they justify that to the public.
They didn't have to. They're in charge. They don't give a shit about us. We're peons. They don't have to try to justify anything.
In my world thesis, they used to have to at least pretend to tell the truth and be honest. It's not like it is today. Back in those days, they at least had to pay lip service to obeying the law. They had to make it look legitimate back then, because the voters actually had a conscience and weren't full, all the way down the full tribalist road. Other thing I was going to say is, you were talking about Bukele. Ron Partain asked me to come on his channel a couple of years ago to ask the question about is suspending the Constitution. Is that legitimate? So when Bukele got in there, he suspended the Constitution supposed to be for a limited time period, so he could round up all the gangsters. So if that were to happen in the United States, would we allow a president to suspend the Constitution, and when is it appropriate to unsuspend it and go back to the rule of law? Because this is, as much as we agree with what he's doing down there, at the end of the day, this is a dictatorship.
Yes.
It's one that's very popular with the people, but they are not living under a constitution anymore. So at what point does he have to easily? We did the show 2 or 3 years ago, and he's, no sign. Yeah, he's cleaned up the streets. They got almost no crime. Their economy's flourishing. Does he let go of the power? That's what's really going to determine his long-term future. And can he set an example for other countries to follow by doing so and restoring the Constitution and then not becoming a dictator for life? That's going to be interesting to watch.
Well, they did have an election. So.
Yeah, about that.
Renee, go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, bravo on the Pilgrim Society opening Secret Society episode today. Where in the world has this Lillian Scott Troy been, kept? I mean, my gosh, she seemed to know everything. This woman has totally been hidden, but just lays it all out. And yeah, it was a great show. I highly recommend everybody to watch it because it kind of connects everything we've learned here, plus the military-industrial complex, as Warhamster shares. Yeah, it's a really juicy episode. Highly recommend. And then regarding this chapter today, Colonel, I've been thinking lately, after digging more into, you mentioned Nixon and why he was kind of, forced out. And I kind of question now, because when I was trying to understand more of Condor and pre-Condor and the PCC and these gangs in Brazil, the early networks, before Stefano della Chiaie, or however you say his name, and Klaus Barbie and whatever.
Delachaise sounds so much better, Renee.
All right. I don't know how, but Delachaise. Before all these cats were doing their dirty business and dirty wars in South America, it was once again the Frenchies and the French connection. And so when you really have to dig on that early French connection movement in Canada, North America, Mexico, Cuba, and South America and Central America. And it's hard to find all that stuff. They've really washed it. And it's interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was the time. I mean, we know a lot about, everyone thinks the mafia, they think of Italian. They don't think of these Corsican Frenchies, right? Which is the OAS and all this other stuff who set up shop in Argentina and stuff, Peron, all that. Well, these whole trafficking lines were originally created by the French. And it was even in the book by, his name is Coleman. He does that. I think I've mentioned it before, of Nixon, the whole international syndicate, and they are the operators, the dope inc. of the drug trafficking system. And he mentions, and it makes more sense to me now, so it's just a thought in my mind, that as they washed out and cleared all the information of the French connection and all these, and the OAS and all this stuff from the internet and records, because you really got to dig through Yandex and you got to push your AI to make them spit it out. Maybe they also were like, okay, because that was the time, didn't they transfer, they passed the baton from the Frenchies to the Italian mafia. They shut down the Corsican drug thing, and then it went over to Sicily, right?
Right.
And so maybe they were like, with the information like you've shared and exposed, you did that great piece on JFK and the OAS and the guys in Montreal and blah, blah, blah. Maybe they just were like, it's time to get that one out too, Nixon out, because it's a possibility. I'm just saying it's something I think about now once after digging on the French side, which is really hidden. Just a thought.
So it is interesting to note because we found out, years ago when we were first researching this, that the Nixon war on drugs was actually the Nixon war on eliminating the Corsican mafia, and that Nixon and the French president had collaborated to kill over 350 Corsican mafia people within like an 18-month period of time, just like mass murder. Get rid of them all. It was like the 19, whatever it was, 80s in Miami, where people are just dropping like flies when they were having the Escobar versus the Cuban exile fight for drug trafficking control in Miami. They had the exact same thing in the early 70s in the Marseille area where the Corsican mafia was. They were just dropping like flies. They were being assassinated. And that was really the quote unquote war on drugs. It was eliminating the CIA French competition, because if you guys remember, from the heroin that was going on over in Southeast Asia, the proceeds, according to that one meeting, was that it was kind of divided, and part of it's going to go to Marseille because at the time they had the better manufacturing. Their number 4 grade heroin was the best in the world. You could get premium money for the CIA Sicilian guys hadn't figured out how to make that higher quality. But once they had advanced in their quote unquote pharmaceutical labs in Sicily and got what they can consider to be a near peer competitor, they just wiped the Corsican mafia off the face of the earth. Not that they got every single person, they got all the big guys. And they basically just fell apart. So yes, that was done. And then shortly after that, Nixon's out. So we'll have to just put that in our brain and let that spin around as we continue our research, because it is certainly possible they were turning the corner. And if you look what happened afterwards with the Ford and Nelson Rockefeller temporary administration there, a lot of really interest, because what was going on during that period of time? The exposure of the CIA and the JFK re-examination of the assassination. And you cannot have somebody that is even the slightest bit interested in the truth in charge when this can of worms is going to explode, which it did. And it was nicely contained by Ford, who was on the Warren Commission, and how the whole thing was set up. So it could be that Nixon was kicked out to bring in the B team, which was the containment team. So just my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's just, yeah, it's a lot. It kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of pieces to put together. And I agree with you, Renee. That is one of those question marks that we had early on as to, because we know Nixon was corrupt as hell. We went through the whole story. So why did they turn sour on him? It may be that they didn't turn sour on him. They just had a better, more controlled set of administrators to bring in for basically a limited hangout couple of years. And maybe they thought Nixon was not the guy for that job, or maybe he turned him down. maybe he said he wasn't going to do that. I don't know. He hated JFK, so I can't imagine why he wouldn't be party to the cover up continuing, because he never forgave JFK from that debate debacle in 1960. So, or Hamster, go ahead.
I'll give you a little teaser here. I'm going to, in an episode that you and I do together in the near future, I'm going to drop a theory on why they got rid of Nixon that probably hasn't been floated by too many people. And I'll just give you a hint. All roads lead to the Rockefellers.
Well, I mean, we ended up with one of them, right, as VP.
Yeah, but this is a little bit more complex than that. I'm just going to tease it for now, but that's coming very, very soon.
Okay.
And I would love to hear your reaction to it, because I have not put this theory out there publicly before, but I'm pretty confident it's going to be worth discussing.
Well, all of this shit's worth discussing. Yeah, I look forward to it. All right. Anyone else got anything? Nope. All along, you asked for a speaker and I didn't hear anything from you.
Oh, that was by mistake.
Okay.
For once I'm admitting I have nothing to say.
Okay. Well, I know I stole your punchline there by the cover up of the re-examination of the JFK. Okay. All right. Guys, thank you for being here. You guys have a nice weekend. I will not be on social media as much this weekend. I'm not going to be on the Tommy podcast. I may be able to squeeze it in. They're having it tomorrow at 10, and that's the time they were originally bringing over my grandson. But if my son-in-law gets a flight, because he's going through flight school in the morning, it'll be at 11, and I'll be able to do an hour worth of the show. So that's still kind of a influx right there. But otherwise, I will have him most of the weekend by myself. And so I will not be on social media as much as normal. I am going to try to get one more of the shows done on our premium series on Propaganda Due this evening, before the crazy weekend and before we go out of town. So let's talk about next week real quick. I will be traveling on Monday. So the chances of there being a show is very slim. I might be able to do one. I might be able to do one Monday evening, but it would be around like 7:30 or 8. So that's for Monday. Let me look. Okay. We are going to Georgia, just outside of Macon tomorrow, or Monday, sorry. And then we're traveling the rest of the way to Nashville the next day. So that one will likely be later as well, if we do one. And then the rest of the week looks pretty good. But again, we're going into July 4th weekend. Warhamster and I talked about doing our show on the 3rd. Tentatively, that's still a good, but it may get canceled. I don't do the party planning on these weekend or these RB trips. So once we get there and get it all sorted out, I'll put out a show schedule. So that's it. So no show Monday and Tuesday at 4:00, but chances are I will be doing a Monday and Tuesday show at 8:00. But for those of you guys on YouTube that are not on X, just check in, and if we're going, great. If not, we'll just push it a day or two down the road. Okay. All right, everybody, have a nice weekend as we go through this last crazy few days of June into the 4th of July. And I am so excited. All right, take care, everybody. Thank you guys for being here. Appreciate it. Have a nice weekend.